Well, a very warm welcome to today's webinar on the subject of Towards Education Recovery, Embedding Digital Learning in Education Catch-up. I'm David Laws, the chair of the Education Policy Institute, and I will also be chairing the debate that we're going to have today. And we're very grateful indeed to Apple, who have supported this and other events on digital learning over the last 6 months or so. Obviously, the education system has had some huge challenges to contend with over the last year or so of the pandemic, dealing with social distancing, dealing with the online learning that's had to take place under emergency circumstances. As we're speaking, trying to deal with the consequences of not having the normal run of examinations and having to put in place assessment systems to generate grades from the school to the exam boards. And all of those have created a lot of pressure on the school system and school leaders. But we're now, I think, moving to the point where, because many of those issues are being resolved, we can turn more to the process of education recovery, catch up if you like, whether you like that choice of words or not, and focusing both on education catch up and well-being catch up. And that's our focus today, but thinking about how digital learning can contribute to that challenge. At the Education Policy Institute, we've been doing some work over the last 6 months or so that will go on for the rest of this year to try to map out the extent of learning loss during the pandemic and to gauge just how much recovery work we're going to have to do. And we've been involved in an interesting partnership with Renaissance Learning, using their assessment data to then feed information into the Department for Education to estimate how far pupils may be behind in their learning, the extent to which that differs by disadvantage characteristic and also region of the country. And we're just about to process the data from the January, February, March 21 lockdown, the recent lockdown, to help inform policymakers of what has happened to learning loss during the 3 months of, or 2 or 3 months of school presence that we've had recently, and that will be very key information that they're waiting for. I think it's no secret, however, that what we're seeing is learning loss across the country. That's fairly consistent across year groups, although perhaps slightly more concentrated on the very youngest year groups, and it's certainly larger in some regions and for more disadvantaged and vulnerable learners. To help meet the challenge of addressing that learning loss, we've not only got the work that's going on at present in many schools and colleges and early years centres across the country, but we've also got the very important work that's being done by Sir Kevan Collins, the Education Recovery Commissioner, who's been asked by the Prime Minister to draw up a set of policies to mitigate the education losses and the wellbeing losses that have taken place, so that by the end of the Parliament we recover at least to the pre-pandemic situation in relation to education and learning loss. And it's going to be very interesting to hear from Kevan in a moment. The education lockdown that we saw last year and in January, February, March massively increased the need for and the amount of online digital learning in our schools. Some schools were already well prepared for that. Some had a lot of catching up to do. Earlier roundtables and webinars that we've held have looked at some of the early challenges of digital learning, particularly ensuring capacity in schools, ensuring that young people had enough devices. Now I think we're moving on to a more sophisticated debate, not just about whether we've all got enough computers and laptops, but how digital learning can help in the catch-up process, and beyond the immediate challenges of catch-up, how the education landscape will be changed by digital learning and how we can use more of this in the future to support young people in their learning and in their well-being. And today we're focusing particularly on some of the short and medium-term challenges. We've got two great panels of speakers to debate these issues and to give you their own insights, and I'll introduce them in a moment. But firstly, I'm really pleased that we've got, for a short period of time, Sir Kevan Collins, the Recovery Commissioner, who I thought we weren't going to have until later on in the session because he's been in and out of government offices today, no doubt, talking to ministers and others about his recovery plans. I don't know whether we can read anything from his demeanor into how successful his discussions have been. Probably not, if he's a good card player. But I'm going to hand over now to Kevan as the thunder sounds over Kennington to say a little bit about his work and to lead into the debates that we're about to have. Kevan, over to you.
Thanks, David. And I think the thunder over Kennington is a much more useful kind of indicator of what's going on. Yeah, we obviously, and I'm so pleased to be here, we're in the real knocking end of working out what the recovery approach should be. And I can't say too much about that, but what I do want to talk about is the theme of this event, which is the place of digital in all of that, and what we've learned in this unprecedented shock to our education system. It seems to me that there are 4 things I'd quite like to just quickly cover in the time for sort of 5-10 minutes or so that you've asked me to speak. The first is, and I think it's we will look back at the way technology stood up and played its part in supporting young people through the shock. I almost dread to think what it might have been like if we hadn't had access to technology the way that we've had. Unfortunately, it hasn't been consistent. It hasn't been for everybody, but we just have to stand back and admire the ingenuity, the commitment, the innovation that happened in our schools as people turned literally on a sixpence to do what they've done, to deliver what they did and what they could. I think it's just been a remarkable event that we should all be proud of as this generation of educators. We've seen technology enter into our system over the last 15-20 years. The promise has always been there. It's never really broken through. I don't think it's ever really disrupted the mass of education, but I think what's happened is there has been a huge leap forward. And one of the captures of this awful experience we've had must be the way that we now weave technology forever into a blended experience for our young people. The second capture on that while we're doing it, I think, must be the way that parents have just been inspirational. So many parents, the way they've engaged deeply in their children's learning, and how that must be another capture that we must hold on to and build into our thinking about building better, building back better, if you like, a stronger and fairer system is what I hope we end up with. And when you think about that leap forward in technology, I think what's interesting is it's been in at least 3 kind of critical domains of education. Obviously, it's been in the learning, the way we've seen young people engage in the resources themselves improve and develop, rather than just trying to replace actually do something different with the technology, building independent skills, building the way young people have participated. I've joined many lessons, and actually interestingly around the world, where young people have been involved in lessons together on Zoom and whatever it might be. And there's a different kind of learning happening. It's not instead of, it's as well as. And I think we're at the foothills of really understanding the pedagogy and the learning that's happening in that environment, but it's something very, very interesting. So there's something about the learning. There's equally, and we've learned what kind of learning best happens there, and what learning can only ever happen when you're in a social environment with each other. And we're beginning to realize that a rich experience of both those environments is necessary for a full and rounded education. I think we've always known that, but understanding what can be located where, I think, more and more clearly. I think the second element, which I've always wished, and as you know, before I was doing this, I was involved in some ed tech work on the ground, is how we can use it to better support our teaching and our teachers. There's so much we do as teachers that actually could be easily handed over to the technology. How many times have we marked things that are correct? Not a great use of teacher time, unless it's, you can feed that back quite easily into your thinking and planning. There's a lot more we can do with technology to support our teaching in both in the planning, and in the teaching and in the assessment, those kind of that magic triangle which summarizes what we do, so that the way it's informing our teaching and our teachers to reduce the workload, to take the burden, to shift some of that across, which I think we should do without apology, if the technology can do it. And then finally, and one that might have come as a surprise or not, but I think the way that we have relationships with parents, I know it's a trite point, but will parents' evenings ever be the same again? Why should they be? Hunting for a car parking space on a wet Tuesday night? Why would you want to do that? I think we can have much more regular and frequent direct relationships. Again, never instead of, but as well as. So there's a whole set of implications for me. And by the way, on the teaching, I think professional development can take a great step forward in the way that technology can help us collaborate with each other. But if that's the promise, we also, as ever in this experience, learned something about the Great Divide in England and the inequality and the way that variation revealed itself to be a feature of our system, one that we've got to tackle. So before the event, the ONS had, as you know, in 2018 done a huge survey which indicated that something like 12% of people between 11 to 18 reported they had no internet access through a tablet or a computer. Something like 60,000 have no home internet at all. So this divide, and yet, by the way, 68% of young people in that group, 11 to 18, said they'd find it hard to do their homework and their education without access. So we already knew before COVID that this was becoming a feature of learning and the requirement of learning, and yet we have this gap. So it's great news that we've handed out devices. The DFE will make a big deal, as they should, and they should be proud of the fact they eventually got their 1.3 million out the door. But they weren't the only people that did this. There are maths, I can see on the screen now, there are colleagues across the country at local authority level, individual schools that took it on themselves to make sure they got the hardware and got it out to young people and got the connectivity going, which has to go with it, obviously. The work that was done by teachers who contributed lessons to Oak and around beyond Oak to each other. So there was this huge effort to try and close that divide. I don't think we've closed it. I don't think we've met that challenge. I think it's one we're going to have to meet. I think it's going to become as ubiquitous as being able to flick a light switch and expect the electricity to be there. You're going to have technology if you're going to fully participate in the learning of the future. I just think we can't accept that young people, some are excluded from that. That won't be something we can live with and tolerate. So we're going to have to do more. And in the recovery plan itself, there might be a moment when people actually now want to turn away from screens for a little while. And I can totally understand that. But it will only be for a little while, because while we need to promote and engage opportunities for social interaction, and anyone who's heard me talk about the recovery will know that I'm deeply kind of committed to the idea that we attend to the non-academic social and emotional development of children, and that happens with each other. And not in isolation necessarily, alongside the academic. I think we're going to have to build both the technology and the face-to-face into the way we describe the recovery. So if you take one plank of the recovery that I'm very committed to, is the way that we offer second wave teaching for children. You know, we've got a generation now that have missed on average 115 days of their 190 in the last academic year. They're going to need not only great first wave teaching, I think it's Geoff who coined the great phrase, teach like you've never taught before, but you're also going to have great second wave teaching and one-to-one and small group tuition. That can be delivered very effectively in all sorts of communities remotely and through technology, and we're going to have to keep building on that. Equally, the third plank, if you've got second wave teaching, another plank in the recovery might be the way we develop and support our teaching, so our teachers get the chance to be the best teachers they can be. I think technology is going to have a huge role. Why would we be schlepping off to a teacher center to watch someone's PowerPoint slides when we can have a great conversation efficiently and effectively together, very close to the moment of teaching almost, which I think is always when training's better and at its best and development's at its best. And then the third one, I think, is my desire, and this is perhaps where the technology might take a backseat, and that is that children spend more time in enriched experiences. And for now, I think, and this isn't to stymie this debate, but for now, that might not be so technology based. That might be more social. That might be playing in sports teams or volunteering or singing or drama. And I think we need to get the balance right. But without doubt, this must be now taking the opportunity we've had, grabbing and harnessing the capture of technology in this experience and building it and weaving it into a completely different view of technology as part of the recovery, but also the long-term sustained improvement in our system.
Kevan, that was great. Thank you so much for those opening comments, which have really covered a tremendous amount of ground and identified some issues that the panelists may well want to pick up in the debates that are about to take place. We know that you have got your work cut out at the moment, and we're very pleased that you could find time in a busy diary to be with us here today. So we're not expecting you to be around for the rest of the webinar, although you're welcome if you want to, but I think you've got to go off to some of the cross-government discussions that are going on around your recovery plan, and I'm sure we all wish you the very best of luck in the work that you're doing on that. So thank you very much indeed, Kevan. We now move on to the first panel debate today, and this is very much on the issue of how digital can help to identify learning loss and then target the support to young people that will help them to recover lost learning. And actually we're going to go on to discuss well-being impacts as well in the second panel. So we've asked our panelists to focus on issues including how can digital learning support the monitoring of pupil progress, how much learning has been lost during the pandemic and how individual pupils can catch up, which groups might be targeted for a blended or remote learning catch-up offer, including those that may have had to shield or still be shielding, and how might schools use their recovery funding or premium in this area in order to support this type of learning catch-up. And we've got a great panel of 5 individuals who we've asked to speak for about 5 minutes each. Feel free to send in any questions that you've got via the chat. And then if we've got time left, which I hope we will at the end of the panel discussion, I'm going to select some of those questions we've got and lob them gently, of course, towards the panelists to tackle. And I'm going to come first to Kevin's successor as Chief Executive of the Education Endowment Foundation, Becky Francis. Becky, over to you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, David. And what a hard act to follow. Kevin's touched on so many key issues here. I guess you asked to start with, David, about trends. And of course, the EPI has been at the cutting edge of supplying information here too. We can clearly see now that at the national level, there are trends emerging. We see this consistently across reports. Disadvantaged pupils and of course schools with high percentage of disadvantaged pupils seem to have been more impacted by national lockdowns, exactly as we would have anticipated. There's some preliminary evidence that numeracy has been more affected than reading. Early language also seems to be a key area. And again, preliminary evidence that perhaps impact's been larger for younger pupils. But of course, this is still only largely based on data from the first national lockdown. And it's not completely consistent between all reports. Some have found learning losses equal between different subject areas and age groups, for example. So this is really important to continue to monitor. One of the concerning issues is that the early evidence now beginning to emerge from the autumn term is that we haven't seen a great rebound for kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. So the long-term sustained approach to narrowing the gap, that emergent gap that's grown, will be absolutely crucial. And of course, that's where Sir Kevin's work will be so important. So I don't want to take up too much time, but a couple of remarks about some of the other questions that David's raised. In terms of monitoring, obviously, monitoring the impact of lockdowns is crucial, whether that's through digital means or through other more traditional mechanisms. And of course, digital technology can support principles of good diagnostic assessment, for example, quickly compiling questions that lots of pupils have struggled with and so forth. And schools are already proving really innovative in using these opportunities. Many of our studies as well that have identified learning gaps have used digitally administered tests to track trends. Of course, we're missing the national level testing data at the moment, so that's been really important. But of course, so these are some of the opportunities, and as Sir Kevan was saying as well, there are opportunities around efficiencies as well and flexibility, of course. But one of the key questions, I think, going forward is whether the opportunities of digital provision actually transform teaching, because it's the quality of teaching that is crucial and underpins everything. We know that the evidence is very clear here. It's quality of teaching that makes most difference to pupil progress, and that's particularly important for kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. Our rapid evidence assessment on the evidence around remote education and digital provision taken in the early phases of lockdown showed really surprising lack of evidence in this area, which is a worry, and organisations like mine have a role here in driving that evidence forward quickly. But what evidence is there in place regarding the school system was again clear. It's really important to focus on the best evidence for quality teaching practice first, rather than exciting with the sort of the whizzy and the exciting in regard to new technology. Things that contain high quality teaching practice, you know, assessing pupil needs, scaffolding and so forth, high quality feedback and so forth, have are more important than the sort of technology that you use. And then the other point was that the support that gets put around use of new technology is also crucial. I mean, schools have moved so impressively quickly to deliver this in really challenging circumstances. But of course, this was fresh to very many. And so that level of support and CPD and the quality of implementation that's put around this is really key, and the evidence is clear on that as well. So to conclude there are clear opportunities, as I've said, for efficiency, for flexibility, for democratizing access to high quality education even. But we do know that when education is delivered in the home and reliant on families and the access and engagement issues and so forth, that home environment inevitably widens inequality. So thinking creatively about how we can address some of those key challenges will be very important. Thank you.
Becky, thank you. That was tremendously helpful. And we've had a couple of questions coming in while you've been speaking, but I'll put those at the end of the panel session. So I'm now going to come to Geoff Barton, who will be well known to all of you as the General Secretary of ASCL. Geoff.
Hello, afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to join you. I'm very pleased with the title of this, Embedding Digital Learning in Education, because it's talking about learning fundamentally. It's talking about IT not as kit, which largely has been the narrative of the last year, as if getting a piece of metal with a chip in it is the solution to it. Essentially what we are learning about, and it's been implied from what Kevan and Becky have said, is how do teachers use that as part of their armoury. And I think, so much of the narrative has been about a deficit model of catch up and so on. Actually, what we're hearing, I think this afternoon, there's a real opportunity here for teachers to start to think, how can I use all kinds of bits of digital technology which are going to help children to learn better? And I think one thing which I learned from Kevan very early on is that this is a distinctive moment to do that. And it's distinctive not just because when we talk about children having lost out on learning, we can say, well, the children in that school have suffered more than the children in that school. It's really not as simple as that, as people know. Nor can you say children in that class have lost out more than children in that class. Within the class I am teaching my English to, the level of learning loss will be very different. And that then leads us into what is it distinctively that technology can do, which I as a teacher or as a teaching assistant or as a tutor can't do. So what I want to kind of explore is two things. How technology can be particularly good for young people and what it can do for them at this time. And secondly, and it's been hinted at, how that could start to be transformational for a teaching profession, which frankly needs to start thinking about what it looks like in the 21st century. This is an opportunity, I think, ultimately to attract more great people into the profession and to keep them there. But you see if you agree with the hypothesis of that. I start, as always, with a quotation, because I think what we often get is this terrible polarized debate about if we're talking about young people learning on technology, then we're not talking about a knowledge-rich curriculum and so on. So could we just take it as read that the curriculum is the curriculum? We will decide what children want to need to learn, but then it's about the how. It leads us into the pedagogy of all of that, and that's the interesting and creative bit. But my quotation is from Stephen Fry, who says books are no more threatened by Kindle than stairs are threatened by elevators. So in other words, you know, whether you're reading in a book or whether you're reading in a Kindle, you're reading stuff, and whether you're going up in an escalator or you're going up on stairs. So let's not have a debate about the curriculum here. Let's just talk about what is it technology could do. And partly through a partnership with Apple, as ASCL has had now for 4 years, one of the things it made me recognize particularly is if I'm a child who is struggling to learn something because either my teacher's not very good or I just can't learn it, suddenly there is the opportunity for the computer to do things that my teacher couldn't do, even if it's the best teacher in the universe. So the computer will make text bigger for me. The computer will read the text aloud to me. If I don't understand what my teacher says, I can find another teacher somewhere else in the world explaining that topic, and I can learn it in a different way. And this starts to personalize the sense of what is it like to be learning. And you look at some of the artificial intelligence stuff that various companies are using now. The quality of feedback young people are getting is better in many cases than what they would get from their teacher. And some of the most interesting systems aren't just then feeding that back to the teacher to say, who are the young people in your class who are struggling with this? But they are comparing it nationally with how young people are doing on that topic to say these appear to be the blocks for young people, so that I, the human, learning from what the robot has told me, can then explain things with humor, with empathy and all of that. And I think that's a very interesting moment of us starting to liberate teachers to do what we, the human beings, can do, and leave the robots to do the repetitive stuff. And those young people who basically need to do repetitive stuff of practicing things. Suddenly, as a teacher, my classroom becomes, I think, a really creative place to use and deploy some of those. So I think there is an opportunity for us to have a look at what we have learnt there. And certainly there's anecdotal evidence of some young people saying they did feel liberated at learning from home, because some of that embarrassment of putting their hand up in a class and worrying that someone might snigger at something they said, they found it easier to be able to think things through and to put it in the chat and stuff. So the more we can simply garner good practice over the past year, it seems to me, the better. So I think there are huge optimistic benefits for children and young people, and the corollary of that is, what does that mean for teachers? Well, it means that technology can start to do some of that heavy lifting, that the quality of the assessment being done frees me up to do the explaining in the way that I've said. But it also, and Kevan kind of hinted at this, may allow something that we've never been able to quite crack in the English education system, that CPD is embedded into what I do, because technology allows me to plan a lesson with you, whether you're working at home or in another school, and I am learning from what you do as I plan a lesson for later on this morning, rather than pushing CPD either to the margins of the day in meetings or the margins of terms in training days. So you can see I take the bigger view that this is an extraordinary opportunity for us, and an opportunity to refresh the way we as teachers and teaching assistants work. And frankly, we have to do that, because simply thinking that we can just do more of the same is not going to work. Thanks very much.
Geoff, that was great. Thank you very much. Again, you covered a huge area of territory and signalled and covered some things which are really important for short-term recovery, but also hinted at what some of the longer-term possibilities will be, which we'll also come back to in the second panel discussion. So thank you very much for that. I'm now going to move to Joe Morgan, the CEO of the Shore Education Trust. Joe, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, and welcome everybody. It's lovely to see you all, if it be virtually. I think the challenge that everybody's raised is longitudinal, and I think what David's just alluded to, having a short-term and a long-term approach to this, is absolutely vital in terms of how we plan as a system to revolutionise the futures and level up the agenda for our young people. In our trust, which is a trust which has primary school mainstream, secondary school mainstream, but also SEND right the way through up until the ages of 25, one of the things we've taken the opportunity to review is this use of digital technologies could potentially be the greatest levelling up tool post-COVID, but it is not the only levelling up tool post-COVID. It forms part of a detailed and a conceptual armoury which enables that longitudinal challenge to be addressed by a millefeuille of opportunities, of which digital technologies is one. So we've very much taken a kind of design thinking approach to it by going back to the stakeholders and analysing what it is the stakeholders need and who those stakeholders are. And we derived them down to 3 groups: teachers, parents and community, and to the young people. And from that we came up to with a kind of 5-pronged strategy really around how we can use digital technologies effectively, some of which have already been touched on, so apologies for the repetition. But the first is talking very much about staff training, innovative CPD, research and development, contributing into the areas of resources, how we use data and assessment effectively to create feedback loops that improves the quality of learning and teaching, and in fact designs learning and teaching and its delivery, as well as targeting interventions. I don't like the term catch-up. You would anticipate that, I'm sure. This is all about a new continuum of a learning loop that's just got a different starting point. So children do not feel disenfranchised by the experience they've been through, but they have the opportunity to capitalise on what they have got now through high-quality learning and teaching, express and strong leadership from MAT leaders, head teachers and teachers in the classroom. And I think this is really important because there are key differentials into this broad brushstroke of children are facing learning recovery. One size fits no one. I know it's a cliche, but we have within our trust some people who have had catastrophic loss of learning and others who have had none, and actually others who have accelerated and overachieved from their starting point because this way of conceptualizing learning has really worked for them. So we want to take that learning in as part and parcel of our strategy as we move further forward. The key thing has been about training our staff, but also training our parents to enable them to use technology effectively and not to be scared, because it's a cultural revolution for those folk as well. So we link the staff and the training, the CPD and everything has already been discussed in real-time development with a pedagogical rationale as to why we are doing this, because it would have been, as Geoff alluded to, that metal box does not create the learning revolution. There has to be some inputs into that. But it did cause us to challenge and think about our curriculum models, our curriculum delivery, our learning styles, our approach to blended learning, to capitalise on where it worked well and where there was still significant learning drift. And we did find from our own research and development that engagement from some young people augmented, engagement from staff actually on occasion augmented. Folk who would never be interested in ICT as a technology to facilitate and extend their learning were suddenly knocking on the door to get some of the little bit of the Apple augmented reality stuff because they could see the benefits of it. And so it actually did significantly catapult forward some of the more reticent in terms of technology was quite scary. But we did want a pedagogical rationale because we weren't doing it just because it was shiny and it looked gorgeous and everybody else was doing it. And we particularly wanted to look at how we could use it around testing and recall as well at distance, so that we could plan learning recovery or whatever it was, or whatever the term was, well in advance of young people coming back in. And we also had to look at it very much through the eyes of our 13 SEND schools, where they have a whole portfolio of different challenge, different vulnerability, SEND absence, but accessibility that Geoff has already alluded to as well. How can we create truly personalised and bespoke curricula for every child across our organisation? And the digital technologies has given us those opportunities. We divided it up into 2 key things: the short term, the learning recovery, the learning lag, the stimulation of intervention, and triggering our Tiger team of Institute of Education, central team from the Multi-Academy Trust to go and support each individual school, but using really current and live data. So that addressed the short-term impacts, but the long-term impacts is it completely revolutionised our staffing models, our hardware, our software, our new strategic planning, our pedagogical approach, our learning and teaching strategy more broadly. We've brought in learning and teaching practice, which encourages continual blended models. For example, our alternative provision schools are really benefiting from having a kind of different approach to times of the school day, something as simple as when the children eat, etc., and so on. So it has actually enabled us through the use of digital technologies to take a different lens of a review for the entirety of our strategic planning across the trust, not just in terms of learning and teaching. Because if we're not supporting that efficacy, then actually at the ground level it's not going to take off or be successful. And lastly is a key driver for us was workload and intervention around workload. This has been our greatest seller to our staff. Get a real grip of how this can aid you with your planning, your preparation, hubs working collectively on planning schemes of learning, resources development. Everybody's doing some type of VLE, whether using Firefly, but actually the impact of that on staff workload has been significant and at scale across the multi-academy trust, giving really good strong opportunities for moderation, joint planning, but also then in terms of assessment and feedback for young people, doing it in real time, facilitating individual and bespoke feedback that the children can respond to has had a remarkable impact. So from us, it's been a real opportunity to see what we're doing within the multi-academy trust through a very, very different lens. Out of 12,000 young people, we've got 1,500 devices, so it could only ever be a slice of our revolution, but it's stimulated so much thinking in different ways.
Jo, thank you very much indeed. That was very interesting, and a number of points that you raised there that we've had questions on, which I'm going to come back to if we can at the end of the session. So I'm now going to go to John Murphy, the CEO of Oasis Community Learning. John.
It was just being blown away by Jo Morgan. That was superb. So we've all just come out and we're in the process of coming out of a pandemic. And surely, as Sir Kevan Collins said earlier, this is an opportunity to consider what's really precious to us. What have we learned during this period of time? And I hate the phrase catch up, as if a child is, to be a bucket to be filled. But we're in a situation, aren't we, where we're looking really at the future of education. We want our young people to have a knowledge-rich, skills-rich education where they can really focus on their behaviour and their attitudes and their critical thinking and who they're becoming. Who are they and who are they becoming? So, and again, to what Sir Kevan Collins said earlier, I think it is a huge shout out during this period to all teachers. They are the unsung heroes, I think, of the pandemic. They've done a remarkable job. For us as an organisation in Oasis, what we want to be able to do is we want to reconnect with our young people, reconnect with the children. We want to make sure that we're lighting fires in confidence and lighting a fire of confidence in them so they get that passion. And I think what we're trying to do is twofold. We're trying to create an independence for students to learn, but also focus back on what the research tells us. The research tells us, Hattie's research, the EEF, it tells us, of all the studies, the meta-analysis shows us that instructional coaching will make the most impact in pupil performance. So how do we develop the quality of our teachers? For Oasis, we serve presently 31,400 young people. We've got just under 5,000 staff, and the communities that we serve are 49% free school meals. That's what characterises the communities we serve. There's a huge amount of challenge. I'm really glad in this debate that we're segueing it into mental health later, because over a period of this year, we've had just under 70 attempted suicides across the last year. Sadly, a few of those, we've had 2 young people commit suicide over this period of time. But this is the backdrop to this whole debate. And this, for us in our organisation, what we want to do is create real equity and excellence and make sure there's an equitable entitlement for all the young people we serve. So one of the things that we did, when you look at some of the data that's come out, 51% of households earning between 6 and 10K, they have a stable internet access. If there's a family over 40K, 99% of those households have a stable internet access. The reality is, for our families, that means that it's more likely there's low performance. It's likely that they're going to lack a competitive edge when they go into the job market, and there's a lack of convenience in their learning. So embedding digital learning is absolutely fundamental for the children that we serve, and we're passionate about that. We're so passionate, we've been brave, we've developed a relationship with Apple, who I didn't know was sponsoring this event, and we have leased for every child and for every member of staff an iPad. Why? Because we want to be able for them to be able to broaden their horizons and heighten their expectations. But what the iPad gives is incredible accessibility, but also for teachers, it's an opportunity for innovation. So what we've done is we've focused on baselines, just like Jo's been talking about, across all the children. I think with a particular focus around our integrity for year 6, 11 and 13, who are those year groups who are going to really struggle at times of transition. We wanted to focus on all children, because, I mean, I've got schools from Bradford
you know, through to Croydon. And of course, the experience that they've had during lockdown has been very varied. So we focused fundamentally, first of all, on quality of teaching, making sure there's incremental coaching for every single teacher. We believe the quality of teaching will make the biggest impact. Secondly, with a real focus on the basics of reading and maths, we focused on standardized apps across all of the iPads. So we've got Sumdog, Shobi, Socratic, Storytime Phonics, Literacy Shed. And in secondary, we've really focused on Go Formative, Reading Plus, Hegarty Maths. Why? Because then there's a standard entitlement. So the children at any point can catch up in their learning. And during the 37 summer schools that we're running in the summer, they'll bring their iPads, and that learning, that differentiated learning will be part of that. Why? Because then as an organisation, we'll be able to, in real time, draw down what their experiences are and make sure over this coming year, as Sir Kevin Collins said, I think in the last EPI event, just try to do a few things well, because then you'll be able to know if you've made that progress. And a really big point that I'd make as well is just around mental health. We've had all of our staff trained in adverse childhood experiences for all staff. We're doing something called the Flourishing Assessment, which is a diagnostic tool for every child. So we can take pulse surveys all the time about how the children are managing themselves during this period of recovery on a road to flourishing.
John, thank you very much indeed. That was very interesting and also useful to hear about how you're tackling some of the challenges that we're going to confront that we're covering under the next panel. So thank you very much for that. And then last but not least, Sajid Gulzad, the CEO of the Prince Albert Community Trust. Sajid, over to you.
Thank you, and what a group of colleagues to follow. Thanks, David, for saving me to last. They've stolen all my thunder. So as I sat last night reading with my 5-year-old on an iPad, and she was navigating the app that enabled her to enlarge and text and sound out the letters and so on. I kind of reflected on the same experience with my 20-year-old. Although he's not doing that now, he did that 15 years ago when we were using Oxford Reading Tree and so forth. And the further reflection was on the opportunity that many colleagues today have mentioned of using technology to really equalize the system. We much like many colleagues here, serve communities that have real deprivation. There was a period of time last year when several families were made homeless within the space of a week across some of our schools. And the number of paper packs, for example, that we were having to produce simply because there was no device or connectivity within households. So I think this is a true two-pronged thing. It is very much about how we're using the technology, and I think as a profession we demonstrated our extraordinary ability to adapt to a very, very extreme set of circumstances, and digital strategies that under normal circumstances would have taken many years, developed in the space of weeks and months across the country. But having said that, we know that those schools that perhaps aren't in strong maths or strong networks of local authority schools often felt isolated and weren't able to adapt in the way that we're speaking about. And we know that there are some schools that are hard to reach, and some schools that found real difficulty in harnessing the technology that was out there. And I think that's something that we still need to tackle in the profession. And it really is that seminal moment, I think, in the history of education, where we've got an opportunity to really think about things differently. And I don't think the language of gaps and catch up helps that. The children have had a very different experience to what they would have had. Some, as colleagues have touched on, have benefited from that, from being at home in a comfortable environment. Those that perhaps have had issues of well-being, emotional well-being, and mental health, and for some it's been an issue. For others it hasn't. So I think, and we're still finding out the impact of youngsters being at home for that period of time. But I think to touch on what colleagues have said, I think the quality of teaching is the absolute key to this. And again, this is a real opportunity to explore the use of digital technology in really enhancing teacher development. We've got young teachers, especially those who are in the first 5 years of their careers who haven't had who had really disrupted development, particularly if they're NQTs and post NQTs, but equally those who are in the 3rd or 4th year of their teaching who haven't had the input and development in the way that they would have. And it's about, you know, how I think Geoff mentioned heavy lifting. I think it's really, really important to understand how we can harness that technology to develop colleagues across a number of schools. You know, we know that distance isn't an issue anymore. We've really developed our understanding of the use of technology to support CPD. And I think really key to this, particularly when we're closing that digital poverty gap, is how we enabling parents to access digital technology, how we supporting them to understand its use and its use in supporting their children, and then how we getting those devices connected, etc. I think there's a much larger piece, and with all of this, I think there's definitely a question about sustainability and infrastructure. So we've had a significant input of devices into schools. But you know, your average primary school may have tech support for a couple of days a week because that's what they can afford. And there was a significant need to increase the level of tech support just to get devices ready, safeguarded, ready to send out to families and to youngsters. That takes significant capacity. So how are we enabling schools to sustain this significant input of digital kit, of infrastructure, when those devices need replenishing in 3 to 5 years? And you know, we know that there are those cost pressures on schools mats up and down the country, and you know, the larger mats have done some tremendous work because they've had the capacity to be able to do that. That single local authority school that's you know, sitting in the countryside and isolated from everyone, how are we enabling that school to support their school community in the way that perhaps Oasis have been able to? You know, the tremendous job that John and his colleagues have done, and others as well. So I think there's a real piece there around that sustainability of that digital infrastructure. How can we develop the infrastructure to support the number of devices that are now in our system in order to support all of the things that we're talking about, identifying the gaps, for want of a better term, accelerating that learning where it's needed, and also really thinking about how we can develop, you know, CPD to support teachers where there's been a gap. But also now, you know, how many of our staff had a CPD on delivering lessons remotely, on you know, managing a class of 30 online, and we've all identified, I'm sure, gaps in teacher learning that can be supported by CPD. So I think for me, the kind of key to all of this will be how we support that infrastructure moving forward. I think there are some really good ideas coming through in terms of what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. Are we going to have the circumstances that enable us to do it?
So, Sajid, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. We've had quite a number of questions coming in during your comments, and I'm going to try and put a question to each one of you, but I do want to end this session at no later than 5 o'clock because I want to give the second panel of 4 people a proper chance and then to take a couple of questions. So could you possibly restrict your answers to about 2 minutes? And I know that is very difficult, but if you could, that would be helpful. So 2 for Becky to start off with. One question was about, do we know the extent of any catch up in the autumn term and beyond that? I think, Becky, early on you talked about the catch up as being limited, but any extra clues as to what's been going on, if anything, on catch up, and which groups of pupils haven't been catching up? And I think there was a question just come through as well from Jane Harris. Becky talked helpfully about segmenting what teaching is best done digitally and what's best done in person. How can we apply this idea to supporting children with speech and language? Do you want to just, I know those are 2 quite big issues, Becky, but do you want to just touch on those?
I'll try my best, David. So on the first question, I think that basically the results are still very much to come in on the impact of the autumn term. And at present, there are distinct findings from different projects. I think I'm right, David, I should check this with you, that Renaissance was finding a shrinking of impact over the autumn, suggesting that there has been some recovery. Whereas other studies to date are suggesting that that hasn't been so much the case. And I think that one of the complexities here is about regions. You know, we've heard a lot about differential impact, whether that's regional, whether that's school level, and of course, as the point's been well made, you know, family and in the level of the individual child. But at present, I think it looks as though we're certainly still seeing that gap. And given the impact of the first lockdown, perhaps that's not surprising, but very much still to be followed. And then in relation to the question about language, very much the work that we've commissioned with York, EPI and others is suggesting that early language has been strongly affected. Obviously, we've been delighted to support the Nuffield Early Language Intervention this year that I know many of you will be drawing on. That's supporting reception classes across the land. And that's been incredibly well received. And we've heard all the time about the importance and the appetite here. But again, I think that we'll be learning much more over the next 6 months. We're committed to reporting that. You can see we've got a page on this on our website, so do use that resource. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Becky. I'm going to come to Joe next. Joe, in your comments, you talked about digital as a way potentially of levelling up and closing the gap and so forth. And we've had a question saying, what do panelists think will enable this education revolution, which is being facilitated by online and digital, to act as an accelerator of excellent teaching and learning and as a leveller? Could you say a little bit about that? And are you confident that this is going to be a leveller rather than opening up gaps even further, because people at the higher end of the income scale will be able to exploit this more effectively than at the more disadvantaged end?
Yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely not saying it's a guaranteed leveller. That's my role as the leader of the Multi-Academy Trust in the areas where I've got contextual leverage to do with what I can for my young people within those economic communities which are struggling. And it's not a given, in the portfolio of wraparound support that I need to put in place to enable them to be more level than they ever have been requires a different strategic vision. So we're talking very much from zero, so pre-birth, right the way up to post-25. So rather than seeing just digital as bringing a learning and teaching revolution, we're also seeing it as a pathway into next steps, so into traineeships, into apprenticeships, into work in areas, for example, in the north of Staffordshire and in the Midlands, where we know that there's a dearth of opportunities or opportunities being taken up in Silicon Stoke, for example. So it's about how do you use whatever's going on conceptually in the world of economics to drill down to various different levels within your organisation. So whether it's wraparound care, embracing digital technology, community programs, embracing digital technology, working with apprenticeship providers and employers and LEPs to enable the child who doesn't know anything about anything because their life has been so narrow to access a whole portfolio of education, which will then give them the brightest futures so that they can access proper Silicon Valley from their bedroom in Stoke-on-Trent. So it's about how do you create authentic experiences through digital technologies, which are capitalized on through high quality learning and teaching, but give some type of narrative hook to why young people should be doing that, and the value of education from their own new experiences that they get as a consequence of the digital technologies that would not necessarily have been brought to them previously.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Joe. Geoff, a quick one for you. We had a question from Place to Be earlier about whether panelists feel that it's currently clear enough for schools that funding from Pupil Premium and Recovery Premium can be used for mental health and well-being support, including, through digital routes. Just wondered whether you wanted to touch on that and whether more needs to be done to inform schools about those funding streams.
I think there's probably quite a lot of clarification on a lot of things. The problem even with the term mental health is it is a continuum, isn't it? Which means I feel anxious when I wake up, through to, as we've heard, you know, suicidal stuff. And therefore, it does seem to me that the fact that mental health is being registered, just like enrichment is being registered, and it's not just about catch up, coming from Kevan, is really important. And the only thing I would probably argue against is having a kind of ring-fenced pot, which is called the mental health pot, because ultimately what we want leaders across their trusts and schools to be able to do is to say, what are the key issues for the young people in front of us, and let's use those resources as appropriate. And I think if that means liberating them to say, for this young person or this group of young people, mental health is the key issue, and we're going to do what we can to support them, then so much the better.
Brilliant, thank you, Geoff. John, I'm going to put two questions to you, a slightly cheeky one that's come in and another one that I think actually is linked to it. The slightly cheeky one, which I suspect is from Schools Week, is about a story they've been running today that the DfE is considering buying 360,000 abacuses for schools to help with catch up, and whether that's a sensible idea. But it's also come in against another question saying, how do teachers assess whether or not tech is any good, if it's safe, secure, causes harm? And would the panel support national policy standards or some sort of oversight body or some sort of steering of procurement for schools, as apparently happens in Scotland? And so I suppose the issue is, should these decisions be devolved to schools to make their choices, or is there a case for central procurement as there may be in the world of abacuses or abacusi, or however you describe them? You're on mute, by the way, John.
That was deliberate in relation to the first question. I answered.
Very wise.
You couldn't hear me, I was actually offline. So you probably know the answer to the first question. In relation to the second question, I think that procurement is a massive issue. I think it was Sajid earlier who said, you know, we're in a situation where if you're a larger trust, then you can develop a larger infrastructure to be around procurement. But value for money and not wasting money is absolutely key. So having a procurement framework that schools could then refer to, I think would be, you know, hugely important. We actually started the Horizons project around procuring iPads in March 2019. The rollout is just finishing now. So we're in a situation where it takes at large scale, something like that is an enormous rollout. You need a project team. You need to have very, very clear procurement framework in which to do that. And I think that that would save every penny for every one of our schools counts. And if you're a head of a one form entry primary school at the moment and you're talking about procurement, it seems like a far reach, when we know that, you know, blended learning and digital and embedding digital learning will be absolutely key for all of our children going forward. And I think it's a fundamental part of the spectrum of learning our children should be offered.
John, thank you very much. Sajid, I'm going to come to you finally, and I'm sorry that I haven't given you more time on this one, but we had a couple of questions about the challenge of education recovery, I'll say, rather than catch up, for children who are non-attending, and a linked question about summer schools, you know, with the implication, can they really help with education recovery if some young children don't actually attend them? And so I suppose the question is, can digital and online learning help us at all to target those young people who might not be engaging, or is it going to be as challenging as for those who are non-attending now or who are not going to come in for summer schools?
Yeah, I think the non-attendance is the same challenge as it's always been. You know, in all sorts of circumstances, you come across schools where attendance is low, and it's about the school really thinking about its strategic approach to improving attendance and identifying why. You know, is it a well-being issue? Is it anxiety? Is it the family's unable to travel? You know, there are all sorts of reasons. So it's about a really well thought attendance an approach to improving attendance and putting those policies and procedures in place and really thinking about who's going to do that work and who's going to be most effective. And then it's about, well, if there are genuine reasons, can we provide some online learning whilst we're cajoling youngsters to come back in? And often, you know, certainly in our circumstances, it's because families have moved away and haven't informed anybody, or, you know, circumstances have changed. And it's about really gathering that intelligence to identify what the problem is. So the key to attendance, I think, firstly, is identifying what the problem is, and then having a really well thought plan as to how you're going to address that. And I think the second question then, in terms of summer schools, I think summer schools really, we need, again, it's this idea that there's this learning that's been lost, and we need to somehow recover it by increasing the number of hours in the day and the number of weeks in the year that children are sat doing some sort of traditional learning. For me, youngsters have lost out on a whole host of experiences, and summer schools really need to be about ensuring that the youngsters have the opportunity to have those experiences that they've missed out on, the outdoor learning, the trips, the visits they've missed out on, which really enrich learning. And certainly for us, where I think Joe mentioned earlier, you know, youngsters who are missing out on experiences that we'd really want them to have, that really help them to develop their knowledge, their understanding, their problem solving skills, relationship building, all of those things that haven't happened because of lockdown. And perhaps even more so if you don't live in a nice leafy suburb and you can go to the local park or go for a walk in the woods. You know, if you live on the 14th floor in a block of flats and it's been much more difficult, what are we doing to address those issues? Because I think those will only support learning in the long run. And we need to think, and I'm sure those of us who are at the chalk face do think about it differently. I'm sure colleagues on this call think about it differently in terms of what are those experiences that we're going to ensure children have in summer school as opposed to traditional learning.
So Jude, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for covering those two issues so comprehensively. We're now going to come on to the final panel in the remaining half hour we've got for the webinar. This is looking a little bit more broadly than the sort of short-term education recovery challenges, to look at building capacity for education recovery in the long term. So we've asked panelists to consider issues such as whether schools can use technology to improve well-being, what subjects are most suited in the longer term to online learning in the future, and can blended learning support longer term recovery investments. So to answer some of those questions, we've again got a fantastic panel, and I'm going to come first to Leora Cruddas, the Chief Executive of the Confederation of School Trusts. Leora.
Thank you so much, David. So, David, I'm interested in exploring what the problem is that we think we're trying to solve here. So I think there was certainly a problem during the pandemic when schools had to pivot their curriculum and teaching to forms of remote education. And on the whole, just to say, you know, they did this superbly well. One of the problems I think we encountered as a nation, and we've just been hearing from the first panel in this respect, was digital poverty or digital exclusion. And I don't think this is just a pandemic problem, but it is a problem that needs our attention. So, for example, the University of Cambridge research found that this is an aspect of deprivation in the UK, and it can't be overlooked as a form of exclusion. So the likelihood of having access to the internet from home increases along with income, such that only 51% of households with earning between £6,000 and £10,000 had home internet access, compared with nearly all households with an income of 40,000 plus. So the link between poverty and digital exclusion is clear. If you are poor, you have less chance of being online. So the researchers for this research quote one head teacher who said this: "I was talking to one family on Friday when I was delivering free meals, and I did take them a paper pack of work because mum said if she was to, it was a choice for her between paying the Wi-Fi or feeding the children this month." So sometimes parents just simply can't afford to pay for Wi-Fi. And I think that's a very significant issue for us. So another head participating in the research said the majority of children in school aren't accessing any of the online learning that we've sent them. I know that some of them don't have reliable internet. Most of them who have anything, have phones or tablets that they often share with siblings. So these stories are well documented. So my first recommendation in sort of slightly longer term is that government needs to work really across government departments to solve the problem of childhood digital poverty. The second problem I think we're trying to solve is perhaps slightly more opaque. And I think this event is about proposing that we embed digital learning in the recovery strategy. So, well, yes and no. Yes, of course, we need children and families to have access to technology for the reasons I've just suggested. But let's not assume that forms of education provision that were a response to a national crisis in a global pandemic are some sort of educational panacea. In my view, nothing can replace the classroom and the what of teaching, in other words, the curriculum, which in my view has primacy. That said, I'd like to just quickly cite Doug Lemov's brilliant distillation of the learning from Daisy Christodoulou's book, Teachers versus Tech. These are the lessons Doug said he took away. Firstly, to understand how to use technology by using and understanding cognitive science. So Daisy's primary argument is that as a profession, we misunderstand or undervalue the science available to us and how learning works. This includes the critical importance of attention, background knowledge, and the way in which memory, long-term memory, perception, etc. interact. And because of this, our efforts to employ technology to improve education go awry. So that's the first thing Doug took away. The second thing is the most useful applications are often less visible. So obviously we know Daisy is not a technophobe. Her book was about using technology, not fighting it. And she has some really useful suggestions. One of the simplest and best, Doug says, is her use of flashcard apps to aid students in studying and building memory through retrieval practice. So some really kind of specific ways in which technology can aid learning. And the third lesson he says he took away is the battle for attention. So he argues that this is one of the most powerful parts of Daisy's book, her discussion on the research on attention and distraction. So I think I think in considering what we are promoting in terms of technology and the recovery, we need to be, exacting in the way that the evidence supports the use of technology. And I think this was obviously a very powerful feature of the first panel. I don't think that we can sort of in a sort of all-encompassing way say, the future of education is edtech. I don't think that's true at all. But I think these very specific ways in which Doug Lemov and Daisy Christodoulou and others crystallize the use of technology is very fertile territory for us.
Leora, thank you very much indeed. That was typically focused and very helpful, so thank you. And I'm now going to come to Dawn Hayward, the Deputy CEO and Education Director of the Windsor Academy Trust. Dawn.
Great, thanks David, and it's inspiring to hear some of the thoughts of other panellists, and I think I will echo many of those. My starting point is that I absolutely believe that digital technology has a really important role to play as we emerge stronger from the COVID-19 pandemic. I talk about it as not an end in itself, but a rocket, a turbo booster to enable young people's learning to be accelerated as we move forwards. And I genuinely believe, as others have said before, is that we are in an inflection point in education now, and we have the opportunity to bend the curve of educational progression. And I thoroughly believe that technology is not the only thing that will do that, but has a critical role in helping us to move through that inflection point. And for me, I think that if we look particularly what we have done here at the Windsor Academy Trust, in our family of 9 academies, 1,200 staff, and 7,000 children, we very much, as Leora spoke, it started in research. being very grounded in research. And that is not just research around the digital technology and the power of digital technology, but also research around cognitive and pedagogical theory. What makes great learning, and how can the research that we've learned from around technology align with some of those pedagogical, sorry, that was my Apple Watch, align with some of those pedagogical theories. So first thing we did is got our head of research to develop this, and you might be able to see it or not, and I've put it in the chat there. This is our a planning for digital technology in education. It's a summary of research. It includes the ones that Leora has spoken about with EEF and others around the power of digital technology and the research that underpins it. So first thing from me is about, we've got to be research grounded. But secondly, I think it's really critical that our vision is in the stars. We don't tinker here. We have a transformational view around how technology is used. And if you look at things like the SAMIR model, we're not just substituting how we currently do things to use technology, but we are actually reimagining, redefining the way in which young people can learn through technology. So, you know, certainly for us, I had a wonderful opportunity to go over to Apple headquarters in Cupertino, California for a week as part of the International Leaders Program. And actually it was mind-blowing to see what the future could be like and what the power of technology has to drive learning, learning forwards. And so for us, what we've certainly done is started with iPads in 2 of our year groups, in year 4 and year 7. We've then, in September, we're moving to 5-year groups for young people. And then by September 2023, all of our students will have an iPad within their hands. Indeed, our staff all have iPads at this stage. And for those young people that don't have them, we've made sure they all have one of their own devices, or we've given them a Chromebook. So we have a number of Chromebooks, and we've given them those. But I guess my 2 points for me, we need to be very cognizant as we emerge from COVID around the short term, but also around the long term and what that vision kind of in the stars looks like. And absolutely in the short term, we are looking at 3 things. One is accurate diagnosis of where our young people are and how technology can help us create that robust diagnosis. So for us, we know that 38% of our young people are where we would expect them to be, irrespective of whether the pandemic had happened or not. We know that an additional 52% of young people, which would take it to 90%, learning can be accelerated where we expect them to be at this stage in their learning through a fantastic curriculum and brilliant, effective teaching and learning. And thirdly, that then just leaves across our subjects 10% of young people who need additional accelerators or boosters. So for me, the fertile ground is absolutely positioning digital technology around the curriculum and around supporting teachers to be even better teachers. And as Leora spoke about, our real kind of golden point with that is around retrieval practice and interleaving of some of those threshold concepts that young people may have been taught remotely throughout the pandemic, and using digital technology, for example, apps like Quizlet to support with retrieval practice. And really importantly, we are really being very clear about how we are building learners' metacognitive and self-regulation skills. One of my colleagues spoke earlier about Professor John Hattie's work. We know those young people who thrive are those young people who have the metacognitive and self-regulation skills. And we've developed our Aspire app to help young people to develop those metacognitive self-regulation skills using digital technology. And then certainly, you know, as we look at additional accelerators for those, particularly those 10% of young people in each of the subjects around mentoring and tutoring, as Becky spoke about earlier on, you know, and being very clear about how technology can support those additional accelerators. But let me kind of be clear about something that a couple of colleagues have touched on. It is really critical we invest in training young people and training our staff as well. So we have dedicated a member of staff across our family to focus for 2 days a week simply on training our staff, creating videos for our staff, creating a digital hub for our staff to support and transform the way in which they are learning. We've transformed our computing curriculum so that young people are learning how to use apps and technology in their computing curriculum rather than taking up their working memory in lessons on how to use the apps. They're focusing on the threshold concepts that we want to move to their long-term memory. And finally, for me, alongside the work we're doing in the short term is absolutely the massive investment in the long term as well. And for us, that long term is hybrid learning. That is young people being able to access learning physically in their classroom and simultaneously to that, being able to access their learning online at the same time as well. So they can self-regulate. If there are misconceptions in their physical classroom, they can have access to that learning online at any point or at any time. And so for me, my summary would certainly be digital technology is a turbo booster for young people's acceleration of learning. We need to position it like they do at NASA. We've got to get it on the right launch pad based upon research and data. And really importantly, our vision has very much got to be in the stars.
Dawn, that was great. Thank you so much. And thank you for also giving us that reference to your document that I'm sure many people want to have a look at later on. That was really interesting. I'm now going to come to Richard, CEO of the Red Kite Learning Trust. Our final speaker will be Emma. And then I'm going to lob in 2 questions probably before we finish at 5:30. And I promise you I won't allow this to really overrun because I know that many of you are busy and will need to leave on time. So Richard, thank you so much for being patient, and over to you. You're on mute, by the way, Richard.
A long time. So I've been sitting here quietly in the background, which is not something I do very easily. Thank you for making it so difficult, putting on so late when everybody else has answered all the questions. Dawn, that was brilliant. And I just want to pick up on where you were, Dawn. So I think we've been working in a parallel universe. About 9 years ago, we made a kind of very bold decision to become a one-to-one school. So one of the schools where there are 2,000 pupils from 11 to 19. At the time, it was really, really hard convincing parents that was a good idea. There were times when I wondered whether it was as well. And we had considerable opposition from some parent groups, actually, as well as a great many enthusiasts. I will admit, and I don't do this very often, to having a smug moment during the last year. When we looked at how easily that school adapted to online learning compared to our school in a very challenging part of the city we serve, in which only 30% of the houses in the estate have access to broadband. And we talk about digital poverty and digital divide. It could never have been more apparent during that. And I would agree with Dawn that, we do want great teachers doing great things, but the technology can really support great teachers to do great things. Like Dawn, we took a starting point where we introduced one-to-one technology as not being about the technology, but being about the teaching and the learning. And we put somebody in charge who was passionate about teaching and learning, but actually was quite lacking in any technology knowledge, or that wasn't her thing. It was brilliant. That's what made it work, by focusing on the learning and teaching and letting the technology follow that. So I can see huge advantages. In fact, it's almost irrelevant, I think, to think anywhere else, that technology should be a part of this blended offer as we go forward. And I'll just say a couple of things about that. One thing is, we've learned, haven't we? And I think this was very well put by Becky. What do we do in school? What do we do out of school? It's amazing when we say it's so important that children come into school, so important, and then we sit them in a row where they're silent. When we want them to come into school, it's when we want them to engage with each other, to do that kind of work they can't do alone in a room. But we do want to be silent at times when, Rob Cohen was saying, you can tell when children are learning because they're doing silent and scratching their head. They can do that at home. They might be able to do that with the support of the online environment. So let's decide really carefully what they can do in school, what they do beyond the school. And if we're doing more of that stuff, of that kind of hard stuff when they're sitting silently outside school, just think of the amazing things we can do in school, at creative in sports, the arts, creativity overall. We can do so much more. So it turbocharges the learning because it enables us to do more within the school day as human beings together, working together, and it puts the value on that human interaction. It does fantastic things for vulnerable children. I watched a brilliant lesson one day in which I was watching a TA when a child was at home, a vulnerable child was at home, and she was going through some reading. But the best thing about it, what was in the corner of the screen, and that was the father of the child in this very tough neighborhood who was sitting with his son playing a part in that reading. And he was developing his confidence in both reading and educating his son. It's a magical moment that would never have happened if it hadn't been for that technology allowing him to be there. And that's a really big insight. I think we can see we developed an app within the company for looking at well-being, which allowed young people to have agency in actually tracking that and actually putting about how they felt, and they'll be able to draw down support for where they were. Another great example of technology being used. But here's my fear. My fear is that we have come, as other commentators have said today, we've come so far in short space of time. The stuff that I, dreamed of, many of us dreamed of might happen in this world, has actually come forward. But it's so easily, isn't it, for us to snap back rather than spring forward. And if you look at many changes, we get to a certain point and we go back. And I spoke to one very senior person within the education system, and I was saying this is with the enthusiasm we've all shown today for this. And they said to me, it's just forget that. We've had tech evangelists for years. It never works. We need to get children back in the classroom with teachers. That's what matters. And for me, it was a little bit like, kind of post-war Britain saying, yeah, we developed the jet engine during the Second World War, but we're going back to propellers because that's what we know and that always worked well. We need to stay in the jet age. We need to not forget what we've learned through this process. We need to not snap back, but we need to step forward. And we need to make sure that we take the learning that people like Dawn and all the rest of you've got and apply it to where we are now. I am absolutely in no doubt that our children will benefit from being in a world of blended learning, and we'll look slightly ridiculous if we put ourselves back into a world of plain grey classrooms, HB pencils and overhead projectors.
Richard, thank you. That was fantastic and very stimulating as always. I'm going to come now to Emma, who has been the most patient of all of us, waiting to speak last. Emma, of course, head of curriculum at Oak National Academy, that's done such important work over the last year or so. Emma, over to you, and thank you for being patient.
Thank you, David. I'd like to think that you saved the best for last, but I might be a bit biased on that. I'm here today to share my thoughts about education recovery, particularly relating to flexible approaches for blended learning, both in and beyond the classroom, relating to my role at Oak. I know many of you will be familiar with Oak and Oak's work last year, but just for those who are not, it's an online classroom and teacher hub that was set up in response to the pandemic. Over 10,000 free video lessons and resources, including quizzing. We've reached over, I think it's 125 million lessons have been taken by pupils in that time, which is just a vast, I'm going to say a mind-blowing figure. And for many teachers during the pandemic, it was a crutch that reduced their workload by providing high-quality lessons to complement the provision that they were providing to their pupils at home. And now, obviously, things across the pandemic is hopefully easing. I think as an education community, we now need to look at those two problems.
Emma, I apologise for interrupting, but your audio quality isn't great. If it's an easy to fix thing, you might want to. If not, we'll just crane forward a little bit more. But I just wanted you to know that.
Is that better?
That is brilliant. Thank you.
Do I need to start again? I'm conscious of time.
No, I think we did. We craned forward and heard, but it was
Okay.
It benefits from the full purity. So
there was always going to be one with this, the pause sound, wasn't there? So that'll be me. I was about to talk about, I think, there's two problems caused by the disruption to schooling. One being that despite teachers' best efforts, pupils have lost learning, and that there's evidence to suggest that perhaps the disadvantage gap has widened and it's affected our most vulnerable students. And so we want to think about how do we help all pupils, but particularly our disadvantaged pupils, recover. And I think two things need to happen. First, we need to identify where the gaps are in their learning, and second, plug those gaps. And obviously this is relating to kind of a traditional learning rather than thinking about well-being, which is obviously hugely important as well. Brought to mind is hearing Becky talk recently about how as teachers, we're really good at identifying and knowing where the gaps are. We know our pupils' strengths and gaps. The problem comes, and this problem I think has always existed, is when we need to address those gaps. So given the gaps are likely to be different in both volume and topic for each pupil, addressing them in class is not an effective solution. So we need to work out how to intervene beyond the classroom. And the problem is two parts. When do we address the gaps? Teachers are really busy, school day is very full. And secondly, who delivers it? It's common knowledge that teachers have hugely heavy workloads. Teachers' time is not only finite, it's hugely precious. And I think the answers to these questions is perhaps where I think it's possible to make gains with a blended learning approach. That is talking about use of technology and online materials to complement classroom teaching. And this approach is nothing new. Online materials have existed for years, and there are some excellent responsive AI platforms that some of the panel speakers have talked about that already support a blended learning approach. But what I think is potentially different to add to the blended toolkit for teachers that we've learnt about in the pandemic is the introduction of asynchronous video lessons. So that is pre-recorded lessons of a strong teacher delivering a full lesson that is aligned with what we know about the science of learning. It's got strong pedagogical features such as modelling and checks for understanding. And we're starting to see evidence suggesting that there's a positive impact in the use of videos in learning. So the EEF report that I think Becky may have mentioned before has found tentative evidence that providing video or live lessons to pupils who are absent is associated with reductions in attainment gaps. And there's been a recent review in higher education suggesting that adding videos is effectively always benefited learning. So back to our questions, when does the intervention happen and who delivers it? Well, we know that in general, teachers know where the gaps are in pupils' knowledge. So the next step, as we discussed, is plugging those gaps. And here are some examples of how I think a blended learning approach can support this. So teachers might set pupils online lessons that are tailored to their specific gaps. And that's what's really important here, to do at home as homework. So for example, these lessons that I'm talking about could be those that Oak have done, where we've got interactive quizzing, we've got the full video lesson, we've got cycles of explanation and practice as you would have in a classroom from a subject specialist. And not only would this be reducing gaps specific to the pupils in their knowledge, but it also makes homework more equitable, because it's often those that need to practice the most that are unable to access homework. Alternatively, these lessons, again chosen to specifically meet needs of each pupil, can be taken at school during a dedicated intervention session, which perhaps is during tutor time at the end of the day. I mean, to be honest, the when is the trickiest part. That's what we struggle to enact the most. But what's important again here is that because the videos are complete lessons, there does not necessarily need to be a subject specialist present. So it could be that a TA or a cover supervisor can support the pupils, thus reducing teacher workload. Education recovery also means making sure that pupils and teachers are able to access high quality lessons from subject specialists. And for pupils, this might mean accessing OAK lessons when absent. But for teachers, they're particularly useful both when a subject specialist teacher is not available. So for example, lesson videos can be played in cover lessons, or when a subject specialism is still being developed. So for example, when perhaps a PE teacher is required to teach maths because maths, the demand for maths teachers outstrips the supply. Or, as we've spoken about, new to teaching teachers, particularly those that have been trained recently, who've had a very disrupted experience, or a primary teacher who's teaching a subject that they are perhaps less confident with. Teachers can use these videos either as PD to get a sense of what might an explanation or a practice task look like for this topic, or interact with them in their classrooms in a kind of co-teacher approach. Anyway, mindful of time, hopefully this has offered a flavour of how I think technology and blended learning might be used to effectively support this longer term education recovery. However, there is a bit of a warning. These and the blended learning approach will only be effective if we also work to resolve the digital divide that Leora and Kevan so eloquently talked about.
Emma, that was tremendously helpful. Thank you very much indeed for that. I'm not going to open up the debate to a whole series of further questions because we are out of time, and I appreciate that time for all of the attendees and panel is limited. I thought the last session was helpful in not only looking to the future, but reminding us in Leora's contribution and Richard's that the assumption that we've dealt with the issue of access to digital over the last year is perhaps a rather complacent one, and that there are access issues, not just for digital equipment, but also Wi-Fi that we mustn't forget about if this process is going to serve all children. We also had a very interesting challenge from one of the questioners who asked us to reflect on the need not only for young people to be good users of digital, but for us to have a curriculum that ensures that we are educating creators of digital content and our digital future, which is something that we will return to. But we are actually going to have another webinar looking beyond the recovery, catch up, call it what you will phase, to how digital learning may change education beyond hopefully the recovery period. And rather than picking up all of the questions that our panelists raised and trying to deal with them in superficial detail in a few minutes, I think I'd rather come back to some of those in the next panel when we hope to have many of you back with us. And I should mention that that second webinar looking at the future of digital learning, some of the issues that particularly the last 4 panelists raised, will be on the 15th of June. So do put that in your diaries. But I'd like to just conclude by thanking all of those who have listened in today. We've had very good attendance. I'd like to thank particularly all our speakers who've taken the time to be here today. We've had some fantastic contributions from all of the speakers, which certainly have given us all pause to reflect. I'd like to thank Apple again for supporting the event. And for those of you who wanted to be able to follow up on some of the points that have been raised today and some of the material that's been referred to, we will be putting out at EPI a paper, probably in July after the next webinar, summarising some of the comments that have been made, not necessarily naming people if they don't want to be named, but summarising the comments and referring you to some of the material that's been discussed today, including some of the works such as that which Dawn flagged up. But thank you all very much indeed for taking part today. Thank you to the panelists, and we hope to see many of you at the next webinar on the 15th of June. Thank you very much indeed.